After my wife's funeral, my stepchildren demanded my entire estate. The rain had not stopped since dawn. It was as if the sky itself had decided to mourn Eleanor's passing. I stood alone beside the fresh grave, staring at the polished oak coffin slowly disappearing beneath damp earth. 42 years together had ended with a few shovels of dirt and a handful of wilted white roses. The guests had already begun leaving. Some whispered polite condolences, others avoided eye contact. Only 3 people remained: my wife's son, Brian, her daughter, Melissa, and their attorney. Neither Brian nor Melissa had shed a single tear during the funeral. Instead, they stood several feet away, speaking quietly while checking expensive watches every few minutes. Their impatience was impossible to miss. When the last mourner walked away, Brian approached me with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Richard," he said, "Mom would have wanted everything handled quickly." I looked at him silently. Melissa folded her arms. "We've already prepared the paperwork." She handed me a thick folder. "I know today is difficult, but the estate shouldn't be delayed." I stared at the documents. My wife's grave was barely covered. Yet here they were, not asking how I was. Not asking whether I needed anything. Only interested in signatures. Brian cleared his throat. "You understand the house, the investments, the accounts. Mom always intended them to stay within her family." Within her family. Those words echoed inside my mind. Apparently, after 42 years of marriage, I wasn't considered family. I slowly opened the folder. Every page had colored tabs. Every signature line was marked. Every legal paragraph highlighted. They had prepared everything before the funeral even began. Melissa forced a sympathetic expression. "We know this isn't easy." No, it wasn't, but not for the reason she imagined. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed my reading glasses. Brian exchanged a confident glance with his sister. He thought victory was only seconds away. One signature, then another, then another. Without saying a word, I calmly signed every page they placed before me. Brian actually smiled. Melissa exhaled with relief. "I knew you'd do the right thing," she whispered. Their attorney collected every document carefully. He checked each signature twice. Everything appeared complete. Brian extended his hand. "No hard feelings." I looked at him. "There never were." He laughed. "I guess this is goodbye." Maybe, maybe not. Just then another car slowly entered the cemetery. A dark sedan stopped beside the pathway. An elderly man stepped out carrying a worn leather briefcase. The moment I saw him, I felt something I hadn't felt all day. Peace. Brian frowned. "Who is that?" I answered quietly. "My attorney." The smiles on their faces faded slightly. Harold Bennett walked toward us with slow but confident steps. He had represented my family for over 30 years. He nodded respectfully toward Eleanor's grave before turning to me. "I'm sorry for your loss, Richard." "Thank you," Brian interrupted. "We've already completed the paperwork." Harold smiled politely. "I'm aware." He adjusted his glasses. "But before anyone leaves, there is one legal matter that absolutely must be addressed." Melissa crossed her arms. "What legal matter?" Harold opened his briefcase. He removed a sealed envelope. The wax seal remained untouched. Across the front were Eleanor's own handwritten words. "To be opened only after my funeral. In the presence of my husband." For the first time all afternoon, Brian looked nervous. Harold held the sealed envelope in both hands for a long moment. The cemetery fell completely silent except for the soft sound of rain tapping against umbrellas. Brian stepped forward impatiently. "What is that supposed to be?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully broke the old wax seal and unfolded several neatly typed pages. Attached to them was a handwritten note in Eleanor's unmistakable cursive. He looked toward me. "Richard, are you ready?" I nodded. Harold began reading. "If you're hearing this, then I am gone. Richard, my love, thank you for giving me 42 years filled with kindness, patience, and unwavering loyalty. I know this day will be difficult for you, but I also know something else. I know exactly what Brian and Melissa will do after my funeral." Both of them froze. Harold continued. "Children, if your first concern after burying your mother is money instead of family, then you have already disappointed me." Melissa's face turned pale. Brian quickly interrupted. "This is ridiculous." Harold calmly raised one finger. "I'm not finished." He resumed reading. "Several years ago, I quietly updated my estate plan after discovering conversations that neither of my children knew I had overheard." Brian's eyes widened. Melissa whispered, "No." Harold continued. "One evening, I heard Brian tell Melissa, once Mom is gone, Richard won't stand in our way." We'll finally get everything. Neither of them spoke. The silence itself became an answer. Harold looked down again. That conversation broke my heart. Not because of the money, but because it showed me how little gratitude remained in your hearts. Brian clenched his fists. She misunderstood. Harold ignored him. Richard never asked me for a single dollar. In fact, throughout our marriage, he insisted that my children should always come first. Every birthday, every graduation, every financial emergency, he helped without expecting anything in return. Memories flooded back, paying Brian's university tuition, helping Melissa buy her first home, covering hospital bills when Brian lost his job. Years of sacrifices, years they had apparently forgotten. Harold turned another page. Because of everything that has happened, I instructed my attorney to include one final condition in my will. Brian suddenly smiled again. There it is. He folded his arms confidently. I knew we'd get to the important part. Harold looked directly at him. Oh, we have. Then he read the clause. My children shall inherit my estate only after Richard personally confirms that they have treated him with dignity, compassion, and respect during the administration of my estate. Brian frowned. What? Harold repeated slowly. The inheritance depends entirely on Richard's written approval. Melissa laughed nervously. Fine. She turned toward me. We're family. Of course he'll approve. Harold wasn't finished. He lifted another document. There is an additional sentence. Everyone became quiet again. If Richard determines that either child has acted out of greed, intimidation, manipulation, or disrespect after my death, then their inheritance shall immediately transfer to the Eleanor Grant Family Foundation. Brian blinked. The what? Harold placed another folder on the hood of his car. The charitable foundation Mrs. Grant created 3 years ago. Melissa's voice shook. My mother had a foundation. Yes. Harold nodded. And she personally funded it. Brian looked furious. How much money are we talking about? Harold adjusted his glasses. The house, the vacation property, the investment portfolio, the art collection, the retirement accounts, the business shares. He paused. Altogether, approximately $28 million. No one spoke. Brian's mouth slowly fell open. Melissa grabbed Harold's arm. This can't be legal. It has already been reviewed by the probate court. Brian pointed directly at me. So he gets to decide. Harold answered without hesitation. No, he simply confirms whether you honored your mother's final request. Brian stared at me with hatred he could no longer hide. Only 10 minutes earlier, he had been smiling as if everything already belonged to him. Now, that smile had completely vanished. And for the first time that day, he realized the true inheritance wasn't controlled by money. It was controlled by character. The rain continued falling as Harold carefully returned the documents to his briefcase. He looked at Brian and Melissa one last time. Your mother left you a fortune. He closed the case with a quiet click. The question is whether your own actions will cost you every penny. Brian's confident expression disappeared completely. The game he thought he had already won had only just begun. The drive home felt longer than it ever had before. Rain streaked across the windshield while silence filled the car. Harold sat beside me, resting his leather briefcase on his lap. Neither of us spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. She knew this day would come. I kept my eyes on the road. How long? 3 years. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. 3 years. Harold nodded. After she overheard Brian and Melissa discussing your future, she came to my office the very next morning. I swallowed hard. She never told me. No. Harold looked out the window. She said if she told you, you'd try to protect them anyway. A sad smile crossed my face. She knew me too well. When we reached the house, I stopped in the driveway but didn't get out immediately. The home looked exactly as it always had. The white porch, the flower beds Eleanor loved, the swing we had built together 20 years earlier. Everything looked the same, yet nothing would ever feel the same again. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. Her favorite blanket still rested on the sofa. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the coffee table. Her reading glasses remained beside her favorite chair. It felt as though she might walk into the room at any moment. Instead, only memories greeted me. The next morning, my phone rang. The screen displayed Brian's name. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Hello. His voice sounded strangely cheerful. Good morning, Richard. He had never called me, Richard, with that much warmth before. I was thinking, maybe Melissa and I could come over. What for? To help. I almost laughed. Help. With the house, the paperwork, anything you need. I paused, then quietly answered, "Come by at noon." Exactly at 12, Brian and Melissa arrived. Brian carried grocery bags. Melissa held a bouquet of flowers. She walked inside with a smile. We thought the house needed something bright. Yesterday she couldn't wait to leave. Today she wanted to decorate. Brian placed food on the kitchen counter. "I bought your favorite soup." "You remembered?" Of course. No, he hadn't. Eleanor had reminded him every winter because he never remembered on his own. For the next several hours they cleaned, organized, and offered constant help. Brian even mowed the lawn. Melissa washed dishes she had ignored for years. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. "Do you need anything? Can I help? You should get some rest." It was almost convincing. Almost. But kindness performed for an inheritance has a very different sound from kindness given freely. Late that afternoon, Harold arrived carrying another small box. "Eleanor wanted you to have this." The box was old cedar wood. Inside lay dozens of letters. Each envelope had a year written across the front. My hands trembled. "They're all from Eleanor." Harold nodded. "She wrote them over many years." I carefully opened the first one. Inside was a short handwritten note. "If you're reading this, then I've already left this world. I hope you know that loving you was the easiest decision I ever made." My vision blurred. Another letter read, "You spent your life making sacrifices for children who were never obligated to love you back. But I noticed every sacrifice." Then another, "You never let Brian know you paid his college tuition after my savings ran short." I froze. Brian looked up from across the room. "What?" Harold quietly answered, "Your mother wanted the truth known." I unfolded the next page. Richard secretly worked night shifts for nearly 2 years so Brian wouldn't have to drop out of university. Brian's face lost all color. "That's impossible." Harold looked directly at him. "It isn't." Melissa whispered, "You never told us." I smiled sadly. "You never asked." Silence filled the room. For the first time in years, neither of them had anything to say. As evening approached, Harold reached into the box one final time. "This," he said quietly, "is the letter Eleanor specifically instructed me to give you after the funeral." Unlike the others, this envelope carried only 3 handwritten words. "The hidden truth." I slowly opened it. The first sentence made my heart stop. "Richard, there is something about our family that I kept secret for more than 25 years. I prayed you would never need to know it. But now, you must." My hands began to shake. I continued reading. Then I looked up at Harold in complete disbelief. He slowly nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "It's true." For several long seconds, I couldn't breathe. The words on the page blurred as tears filled my eyes. I read the first paragraph again, hoping I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. Eleanor had written, "Richard, 25 years ago I made a decision that has weighed on my heart every single day. I never told you because I feared it would destroy our family. Now that I'm gone, you deserve the truth." The room became silent. Brian and Melissa watched me anxiously. Harold remained still. "What does it say?" Melissa asked quietly. I looked at Harold. "You knew." He nodded. "I've known since the day your wife updated her will." I took a deep breath and continued reading. "When Brian was 23, he secretly borrowed a large amount of money using my name without my permission. He was desperate and frightened after making several terrible business decisions." Brian's face instantly turned white. "No," he whispered. The letter continued. "The bank was preparing legal action. If the truth had become public, Brian could have faced criminal charges and his future would have been ruined." Melissa slowly turned toward her brother. "Brian." He couldn't meet her eyes. I continued. "Before you found out, Richard quietly sold the land he inherited from his father. He paid every debt in full and never asked Brian for a single rupee in return." Brian stared at me in complete shock. "You, what?" I remained silent. Harold spoke instead. "It's true." Brian shook his head violently. "No, Mom never told me." "She wasn't the only one," Harold replied. "Richard insisted that no one should ever know." Brian's knees weakened, and he sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "I thought," he whispered. "I thought Mom paid it." I smiled sadly. "I wanted you to have another chance." The room fell silent again. Then Melissa spoke through tears. "Why would you do that for him?" I looked toward the window. "Because your mother loved both of you." Brian buried his face in his hands. "I spent years believing you never cared about us. You never gave me the chance to explain." For the first time since the funeral, Brian began to cry. Not loud sobs, just quiet, genuine tears. "I've hated you for years," he admitted. "And all this time, You were protecting me. I folded Eleanor's letter carefully. There is more. Everyone looked up. I continued reading. If Brian and Melissa truly regret their actions, Richard, forgive them only when you believe their hearts have changed, not because of money, but because they have learned the value of love, gratitude, and family. A long silence followed. The inheritance no longer seemed like the most important thing in the room. What mattered was the truth that had remained hidden for decades. Brian slowly stood. His voice trembled. I'm sorry. It was the first sincere apology I had ever heard from him. I can't undo the past, he said. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to become the man you believed I could be. Melissa wiped away her tears. I judged you without ever knowing what you had done for us. I looked at both of them. Their expressions were different now. The arrogance that had filled the cemetery was gone. Only regret remained. Harold quietly closed his briefcase. Eleanor hoped this day would come, he said. She didn't want a family divided by money. She wanted a family healed by truth. Outside, the rain finally stopped. For the first time since the funeral, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds and shone across Eleanor's garden. I looked at her favorite roses swaying gently in the breeze. Softly, almost to myself, I whispered, "You kept your promise, Eleanor." And somehow, it felt as though she had heard me. 3 days passed after Eleanor's funeral. The house was quieter than ever, but something had changed. Brian and Melissa no longer arrived with forced smiles or carefully rehearsed kindness. They came because they wanted to be there. Brian repaired the broken fence Eleanor had mentioned for years. Melissa spent an afternoon organizing Eleanor's photographs, carefully placing each one into albums. No one mentioned the inheritance. No one mentioned the will. For the first time in decades, we simply shared meals together. I began to believe Eleanor's final wish might actually come true. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, someone knocked on the front door. When I opened it, I saw an elderly woman I had never met. She looked to be in her late 70s, dressed neatly and holding a worn leather folder. "Are you Richard Grant?" she asked softly. "Yes. My name is Margaret Collins. I was Eleanor's closest friend before she moved away many years ago." I invited her inside. Brian and Melissa joined us in the living room. Margaret looked around the house and smiled sadly. She always said this house felt like home. Then her expression became serious. "I promised Eleanor I would deliver these papers only after her funeral." She handed me the old folder. Inside were several handwritten letters, a faded photograph, and a sealed envelope. Across the envelope, Eleanor had written, "Only if Margaret believes the family is finally ready." Margaret nodded. "I think you're ready." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was another letter. "Richard, if this letter has reached you, then something wonderful has happened. My family has finally begun telling each other the truth." I smiled through tears. She knew us so well. The letter continued, "Money was never the greatest gift we could leave behind. Forgiveness was." Brian lowered his head. Melissa quietly wiped away a tear. Then I unfolded the faded photograph. It showed a much younger Eleanor standing beside me on the day we bought our first home. Neither of us had much money. Our clothes were simple. The house behind us was tiny. But our smiles were genuine. Margaret laughed softly. She carried that picture everywhere. I turned it over. On the back, Eleanor had written just one sentence. "We were never rich because of money. We were rich because we never gave up on each other." No one spoke. The room was completely silent. Margaret finally stood. "My promise is fulfilled." Before leaving, she looked at Brian and Melissa. "Your mother loved both of you until her final breath." Then she looked at me. "And she never stopped thanking God for bringing Richard into her life." After she left, Brian slowly walked over to me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Richard, if the inheritance disappeared tomorrow, I'd still want you in my life." Melissa nodded. "So would I." I looked at both of them for a long moment. The bitterness that had once separated us had begun to fade. Perhaps this was the real inheritance Eleanor had planned all along, not the estate, but the chance to become a family again. Just then, my phone rang. It was Harold. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Richard, the probate court has scheduled the final estate hearing." I frowned. "Is something wrong?" "There has been an unexpected legal challenge." "From who?" Harold paused. Then he answered. "Someone claiming Eleanor signed a second, newer will, just 6 months before she died." The room fell silent. Brian and Melissa stared at me in disbelief. If the claim was true, everything Eleanor had planned could be turned upside down. The words echoed through the room. "Someone is claiming Eleanor signed a second will." For several seconds, no one spoke. Brian was the first to break the silence. That's impossible. Melissa shook her head. Mom would have told Harold. Harold sighed on the other end of the phone. That's exactly why I'm concerned. When is the hearing? I asked. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll be there. The next morning, we arrived at the courthouse together. For the first time in years, Brian, Melissa, and I walked through the front doors as one family instead of strangers. Harold met us outside courtroom 3. His expression was unusually tense. There's someone you should meet. Standing near the courtroom entrance was a sharply dressed man in his 50s. I represent Daniel Mercer, he said. Harold frowned. Daniel claims to possess Eleanor's most recent will. Brian whispered, who is Daniel Mercer? I've never heard Mom mention him, Melissa added. Neither had I. Inside the courtroom, the judge entered, and everyone stood. The hearing began quietly. Daniel Mercer finally walked to the front. He was calm and confident. His lawyer handed the judge a sealed folder. Your Honor, the lawyer said, this document was signed 6 months before Mrs. Eleanor Grant's passing and revokes all previous wills. A murmur spread across the courtroom. Brian looked ready to panic. Melissa gripped the edge of the bench. Harold remained perfectly still. The judge examined the document briefly. Then he looked at Harold. Do you contest its validity? I do, Your Honor. On what grounds? Harold stood. Because Eleanor Grant personally informed me that no later will existed. Furthermore, every revision she ever made was prepared through my office. The opposing lawyer smiled. Perhaps she changed attorneys. Harold replied calmly. Then let's examine the evidence. A handwriting expert was called. The courtroom watched in silence as signatures were compared. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the expert looked toward the judge. There are similarities. Brian's heart seemed to stop. The expert continued. But there are also several serious inconsistencies. He pointed to the signature. The pressure, spacing, and pen movement differ significantly from Mrs. Grant's verified signatures. The judge leaned forward. Your opinion? The expert answered clearly. In my professional opinion, this signature is highly likely to be a forgery. Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel's confident smile vanished. His lawyer looked stunned. Harold wasn't finished. He walked to the evidence table and placed another document before the judge. This is Eleanor's medical record from the day the alleged will was supposedly signed. The judge examined it carefully. Harold spoke. According to hospital records, Mrs. Grant was undergoing surgery that entire afternoon. The courtroom became silent. The judge slowly looked toward Daniel. Would you care to explain how Mrs. Grant signed legal documents while under anesthesia? Daniel's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The judge's expression hardened. Court officers. 2 officers immediately approached Daniel. If this document is fraudulent, you may be facing serious civil and criminal consequences. Daniel lowered his head. In a barely audible voice, he confessed. I never expected anyone to check. Brian stared at him in disbelief. You tried to steal our mother's legacy. Daniel whispered. I thought no one would know. An hour later, the judge dismissed the forged will entirely. The original estate plan remains fully valid. Harold smiled quietly. Eleanor's wishes will be honored. Outside the courthouse, Brian turned to me. If you hadn't trusted Harold. I smiled gently. It wasn't about trust. It was about honoring your mother's truth. As we walked down the courthouse steps together, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Harold. Only 6 words appeared on the screen. There's one last letter. I looked up in surprise. I thought we had read them all. Harold smiled. So did I. He reached into his briefcase and carefully removed one final sealed envelope. Across the front, in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, were the words. Open this only after justice is done. I stared at the envelope, realizing that even now, Eleanor still had one final surprise waiting for us. The courthouse parking lot was almost empty by the time we reached Harold's car. The afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the pavement. Harold held the sealed envelope carefully, almost as though it were made of glass. This is the last one, he said quietly. Eleanor instructed me to give it to you only after the court confirmed her original will. I looked at Brian and Melissa. Neither of them spoke. Together, we returned to the house. An hour later, we were sitting around the same dining table where Eleanor had hosted countless family dinners. The envelope rested in front of me. Her familiar handwriting covered the front. For my family, when the truth has finally won. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. I began to read aloud. If this letter has reached you, then honesty has prevailed. That alone tells me there is still hope for our family. I paused for a moment before continuing. Richard, I know you. Even after everything, your first instinct will be to forgive. Brian lowered his head. Melissa quietly wiped away another tear. The letter continued. Children, if you are hearing these words, then you have been given something more valuable than money, a second chance. Silence filled the room. Then came the sentence that none of us expected. Richard, I am asking you to make the final decision completely on your own. If you truly believe Brian and Melissa have changed, release the inheritance. If you believe they have not, let every penny go to the foundation. I slowly lowered the letter. No one moved. The decision Eleanor had protected for years now rested entirely with me. That evening, Brian stood up. He walked to the fireplace and picked up an old family photograph. It showed the four of us on a camping trip nearly 30 years earlier. He smiled sadly. I remember this. So do I replied. He looked at me. I spent years convincing myself you were only Mom's husband. He took a deep breath. But when I look at this picture, his voice cracked. I see the man who taught me to ride a bicycle. Melissa added quietly, and the man who stayed awake all night helping me finish my science project. Neither of them had remembered those moments until now. But I had. Every single one. The following morning, Harold returned with the final probate documents. He placed one sheet of paper in front of me. At the bottom was a single line. Approval of final distribution. One signature. That was all it required. Brian looked at me. If you decide we're not worthy. He swallowed. We'll accept it. Melissa nodded. We're not asking for forgiveness anymore. We're asking for the chance to earn it. For a long moment, I looked at Eleanor's favorite chair. It stood empty beside the window. I could almost hear her gentle voice. Choose with your heart. I picked up the pen. Harold watched silently. Brian held his breath. Melissa closed her eyes. Then, I signed. Harold smiled. The estate will be distributed according to Eleanor's wishes. Brian stared at me in disbelief. You approved it. I nodded. Not because of who you were. I looked at both of them. But because of who you're trying to become. Brian's eyes filled with tears. Without saying a word, he stepped forward and hugged me. For the first time in more than 20 years. I hugged him back. Melissa joined us, and the three of us stood together in the middle of the living room. No lawyers, no judges, no arguments, just family. Several weeks later, Eleanor's foundation held its first charity event. Although Brian and Melissa received their inheritance, they made a decision no one expected. Together, they donated a significant portion of it to the foundation their mother had created. Brian smiled at me. Mom was right, money isn't the greatest inheritance. I smiled. What is? He looked toward Eleanor's portrait hanging on the wall. A family that finds its way back to each other. As the guests applauded, I looked at Eleanor's photograph one last time. Her smile seemed as warm as ever. The estate had been settled. The secrets had been revealed. Justice had been served. But the greatest gift Eleanor left behind wasn't the house, the money, or the investments. It was the chance to heal a broken family. And in the end, that was worth more than any fortune. 6 months later, autumn had arrived, and Eleanor's rose garden was in full bloom once again. Every Saturday morning, Brian, Melissa, and I met at the house for breakfast. It had become our tradition, one Eleanor would have loved. The silence that once filled the home had been replaced with laughter. One afternoon, Harold arrived carrying a small wooden box. I found this while organizing Eleanor's safe deposit records, he said. She wanted you to have it on the first anniversary of settling the estate. Inside the box was a silver pocket watch I had given Eleanor on our 10th wedding anniversary. Wrapped around it was one final handwritten note. I unfolded it carefully. Richard, if you're reading this, then you kept our family together. That was always my greatest hope. Tears filled my eyes. The note continued. Brian and Melissa, if you've chosen love over greed, then you've already honored my memory more than any inheritance ever could. Brian quietly wiped away his tears. Melissa reached across the table and held my hand. Then Harold smiled. There's one more surprise. He handed me a framed certificate. It was from the Eleanor Grant Family Foundation. The board had voted unanimously to rename its annual scholarship. Its new name read, the Richard Grant Scholarship for Kindness and Integrity. I was speechless. I don't deserve this, I whispered. Brian smiled. Yes, you do. Melissa nodded. You spent your life giving without asking for anything in return. A year earlier, Those words would have been impossible to imagine. Now they came from the hearts of the same two people who had once demanded everything I owned. As the sun set behind the house, we walked together into Eleanor's rose garden. Brian placed fresh white roses beside the memorial stone. Melissa softly said, "Thank you, Mom." I looked up at the evening sky and smiled. "We're okay now, Eleanor." A gentle breeze rustled through the roses, and for a brief moment, the garden felt filled with her presence, not as a ghost, but as a memory that would never fade. Her final lesson had never been about wealth. It had been about forgiveness. Her greatest inheritance had never been money. It had been love, and that legacy would live on for generations. 1 year after Eleanor's funeral, life looked completely different. The house no longer felt empty. Every Sunday, the dining table was filled with family, laughter, and stories Eleanor would have loved to hear. Brian had sold his luxury sports car and started mentoring young entrepreneurs who had made the same financial mistakes he once had. Melissa volunteered every weekend at the Eleanor Grant Family Foundation, helping widows and elderly people who had no one to care for them. Neither of them did it for publicity. They did it because they had changed. One crisp autumn morning, Harold called me. "Richard," he said warmly, "there's someone here who wants to meet you." When I arrived at the foundation, I found a young woman in her early 20s waiting in the lobby. She looked nervous. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "I received the first Richard Grant Scholarship." I smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Emily." Tears filled her eyes. "I lost both of my parents when I was 16. I thought I'd never be able to afford college." She held up her graduation photograph. "Because of this scholarship, I'll be the first doctor in my family." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Brian quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. Melissa smiled through tears. "This," she whispered, "is Mom's real legacy." Later that afternoon, the foundation unveiled a bronze plaque near the entrance. It read, "True wealth is measured not by what we keep, but by what we give." Eleanor Grant. Everyone applauded. I looked toward the sky and smiled. Harold leaned over and said quietly, "I think she'd be proud." I nodded. "So do I." As the ceremony ended, Brian turned to me. "Dad." It was the first time he had ever called me that. He looked embarrassed. "I hope that's okay." My eyes filled with tears. I hugged him tightly. "I've waited a very long time to hear that." Melissa joined us. "We love you, Dad." For years, I had believed I had lost my wife. Instead, through her wisdom and courage, I had gained the family I had always hoped for. Sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't written in a will. Sometimes, it's written in the hearts of the people who finally learn what family truly means. 5 years passed. The old house still stood proudly at the end of Maple Street, surrounded by Eleanor's roses, which bloomed more beautifully each spring. Some things had changed. Some things never would. Every year on the anniversary of Eleanor's passing, our family gathered in the garden. No lawyers, no courtrooms, no arguments, only love. Brian had become chairman of the Eleanor Grant Family Foundation. Melissa managed its community outreach programs. Together, they had helped thousands of families rebuild their lives. The foundation had built libraries, funded scholarships, and provided emergency assistance to elderly couples who had nowhere else to turn. One quiet afternoon, Harold visited the house for what would become his final professional meeting. Age had finally convinced him to retire. He smiled as he handed me one last folder. "This isn't legal paperwork," he laughed. "It's simply my retirement letter." Inside was a photograph taken outside the courthouse 5 years earlier. The four of us stood together: Harold, Brian, Melissa, and me. On the back, Harold had written, "Justice settled the estate. Forgiveness built the family." I framed the picture and hung it beside Eleanor's portrait. They belonged together. That evening, the family gathered in the garden. Children ran across the lawn, laughing. Brian's little son ran toward me. "Grandpa Richard." He wrapped his tiny arms around my legs. I smiled. "What happened?" He held up a drawing. I drew Grandma Eleanor. The picture showed bright flowers, a smiling woman, and our family standing together beneath a rainbow. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It captured something even more important: hope. Melissa looked at the drawing and quietly whispered, "Mom would have loved this." As the sun began to set, everyone gathered around the memorial stone. Fresh white roses rested beneath Eleanor's name. I stepped forward and spoke softly. 5 years ago, I believed I had lost everything. I looked at Brian and Melissa. I was wrong. I lost the woman I loved. But because of her wisdom, I gained the children she always hoped we would become. Brian's eyes filled with tears. Melissa smiled through hers. The grandchildren placed flowers beside the memorial. For a moment, no one spoke. The evening breeze gently moved through the roses. It almost felt as if Eleanor was still watching over us. Later that night, I sat alone on the porch with Eleanor's old pocket watch in my hand. Its steady ticking reminded me that time never stops. Life moves forward. Pain slowly becomes memory. Memory becomes gratitude. And gratitude becomes peace. I looked toward the stars and smiled. Thank you, Eleanor. Your final gift wasn't the estate. It wasn't the hidden clause. It wasn't even the truth you protected for so many years. Your greatest gift was teaching us that forgiveness is the richest inheritance anyone can ever leave behind. The porch light glowed warmly behind me. Inside the house, my family laughed together over dinner. I stood, slipped the pocket watch into my coat, and walked back inside. This time, I wasn't walking into an empty house. I was walking home.